Köszönöm nektek, hogy elhittétek, hogy meg lehet csinálni. Köszönöm, hogy elhittétek, hogy megváltoztathatjuk a sorsunkat. Köszönöm, hogy elhittétek, hogy a saját történelmünket mi magunk, a magyar emberek írjuk. Köszönöm, köszönöm, köszönöm. A magyar emberek ma igent mondtak Európára, igent mondtak a szabad Magyarországra, igent mondtak arra, hogy képviseljük őket, hogy segítsük őket, hogy rendbe tegyük az országot, mert ez egy magyar kormány, a mindenkori magyar kormány feladata.
Listeners of Political Junkie, this is my friend Julia Sonnevend, who is Associate Professor of Sociology. And do you have an appointment in Media Studies as well, Julia?
It's called Sociology and Communications. There isn't a Communications department, but it signals that I'm a media scholar too.
Okay, all right. So Julia and I are friends for several reasons, but one being that we're both fascinated with political media. And Julia has written this terrific book called Charm. Here you can see it, and I will link to it on the site so that you can buy it. You can also see that it's kind of short. So if you want to know a lot about political media in a short and really accessible and beautifully written read, you will buy this book. Julia, I'm ecstatic.
I can also show this. This is now the paperback.
Oh, we have a paperback. All right. So that's even less expensive. All right. Yeah. And listeners, we're going to advertise this on Political Junkie. It will take you to bookshop.org, which is my bookshop of choice. I try not to shop at Amazon. I understand Amazon's a little cheaper, but Bookshop will actually give money to your local independent bookstore. So that's why I use them. They're really cool. So Julia's book will be up. Julia, I am so excited, like so many Americans who love freedom, about the defeat of Victor Orbán in Sunday's election. And it was a colossal defeat. Can you tell us a little something about, the political campaign that led to Orbán being unseated? And B, what does this mean for Hungary? Why are people dancing in the streets, literally dancing in the streets?
Literally dancing. Yeah, all of my friends, everybody I know in Budapest and across the country has spent the night dancing on streets, celebrating, opening champagne, and know that these are people, spanning from the far left to the far right, coming together and celebrating. Only like the fall of the Berlin Wall felt probably similar in kind of coming together moment of standing top of the wall. But in terms of the campaign, your first question, I think what is really interesting to see here is that the Péter Magyar campaign was a very simple campaign in many ways. It has basically three core messages. Orbán must go, corruption must stop, and we have to rejoin the West, which in his case, it means NATO, European Union, so kind of orientation away from Russia and towards the West. And he kept repeating these, avoiding any other kind of topics that maybe divide a diverse coalition. Any kind of culture war flashpoints were kind of left out of the communication. And he was laser focused on the issue of corruption. And that's something like with Navalny in Russia that can bring together, a wide variety of people. And then, it's also important to note, as the author of Charm, I pay a lot of attention to that there was a massive difference in the charisma and charm of the two candidates. We also see a generational divide with a 62-year-old Orbán against a 45-year-old Péter Magyar, who is my age. So it's actually really strange and weird to see my generation kind of stepping into this kind of adult role in Hungary. I mean, almost everybody in his orbit is around my age. And there was a strategic positioning in terms of vitality and age in many ways. And it ended up being a kind of a masculinity campaign as well between the two. And for reasons I will never understand, it's one of the mysteries of the campaign, why the Orbán team didn't see that coming. You could send the guy to the gym every single day, knowing that he's against a very athletic, much younger candidate. But somehow there were these very clear missteps being made in the campaign that we can discuss further.
Well, and of course, older men can be very charismatic and charming. I think one of the things we saw in 2016, and anybody who saw him personally, was that Donald Trump had an amazing capacity to charm a crowd. I mean, I saw him, I think, in 2017, 2018, give a speech to a MAGA crowd. And all of a sudden I said, oh my God, I got it. And it was something that I hadn't understood before I saw him in person and really saw him love the crowd. I mean, he would just look at people and say, I love you. And they would say, I love you back. So Orbán had some of that. He also, and I'm remembering this from your book, invoked a kind of throwback normalcy, white families, families that had very sort of classically beautiful features. He would show up at Hungarian festivals of various kinds and invoke a long Hungarian folk past. Did that act kind of get old when Hungarians were like checking their pocketbooks and saying, oh, what's happened? I can't afford anything anymore. I mean, how did that get old? How did that game plan stop working?
That is a really important question, because I do remember growing up that, one of the first formative memories I have as a Hungarian, as a 10-year-old, is a speech by Victor Orbán sending away the Russian troops from Hungary. And he was incredibly charismatic. I remember as a teenager. And then even in the first Orbán government and later on, we always talked about his charisma. And whenever I interview journalists or those who are around him, everybody mentions that he's like a vacuum cleaner. He can suck you in. So there is a personal magnetism happening. So why did that not work? I mean, first of all, yes, it became repetitive. You are dealing with 16 years. And then the other challenge here was that he always positioned himself against a failing, weak, ineffective opposition. And he had certain tropes to use on this, like that we will defend national sovereignty, we will, defend Hungary, and so on. And that did not really work against a candidate who had largely similar messages in that area. And then in many ways, Péter Magyar did the same, going to these festivals, trying out various meals and pastries, hanging out with crowds and so on. And there was also a massive difference in the media apparatus between the two. So you see a well-oiled legacy media combined with social media from a ton of money visibly campaign for Orbán. And you see this kind of startup, cool, authentic, unscripted, open failing campaign of Péter Magyar, and it became simply more relatable over and over. If you see it, and that combined with very powerful messaging on corruption. Don't forget that Péter Magyar is the ex-husband of the former justice minister of Orbán. So this is a guy who sits there at the dinner tables when the deals are being made, all that, for a very long time. He knows everybody. Then he switches sides and turns against them, but he knows all these details. So he brings up names, he brings up stories. People love hearing that. People trust that kind of storytelling because he was part of it. So it's such a powerful outsider-insider role in which somebody is not in the government anymore, but also not in the opposition. It's very hard to match for somebody like Orbán, who is increasingly stuck in his role.
Yeah, it's interesting because I was comparing Péter Magyar to a guy named Spencer Cox, who's the governor of Utah. And I remember after Charlie Kirk was murdered, Spencer Cox was really front and center on that and keeping people calm and telling them not to overreact and reassuring them and so on. And I sat there thinking, could I actually end up voting for the governor of Utah? And I thought, yes, I could. Under the current circumstances, if I thought the only other option was electing someone like J.D. Vance or Marco Rubio, who's in it up to their eyeballs with Donald Trump, I would say, yes, get in there, Spencer Cox, I'll vote for you. And we see people making those kinds of compromises in this election. The liberals pulled all their candidates, did they not?
Yeah, I mean, so it is really interesting, and as you can imagine, Orbán really ran on that message that he's the safe choice. He's the charismatic, older, reliable character. He is this unpredictable guy with a turbulent personal life, who loves sporting, dancing, God knows what else. They really used every conceivable propaganda tool, including women and what So you can imagine the arsenal that was used against Peter Magyar. And it still didn't work. And that's actually is an excellent question of why that kind of messaging. But then we again have to get back to the corruption message that you have a failing healthcare system. You have schools that are struggling. You see that kind of everyday set of problems becoming more and more visible. But still, for a long time, that didn't help. For 16 years, it's not that the schools and the healthcare were excellent during the first Orbán government, but something in the messaging worked better. And here the cracks started to show. And I think it's also, whether one likes Peter Magyar or not, we have to admit that he's an incredible political talent. Somebody within 2 years as a lawyer who has never been part of politics builds up this incredible campaign and gets more than 2/3 majority, so he can really reshape the country. It's an incredible political moment.
Well, it is incredible. And one of the things he committed to, which I'd be interested in what you're hearing on the ground about this, but he committed to reversing the constitutional changes that kept Orbán in power for all of these years. And so Orbán very effectively did a range of things, which Donald Trump and the GOP have been trying to do in the United States to shore up their majority, to limit voting, and Magyar has said he's going to reverse all those constitutional changes. Do you think he will actually do it?
Oh, he has to, because that's the mandate. And with 2/3 majority, you cannot really find excuses. It will be incredibly difficult because you deal with an entrenched system in the business sphere, in education, in the media. So it's not enough to remove the top heads or the big names, which he will, as a first step. But you have to go deeper. And I really hope that he will do it thoughtfully and elegantly. Because, you cannot really replace easily a one kind of sledgehammer approach with another one. But it is also important to admit that in some areas you will need that. So that will be the careful balance that he has to navigate. But Claire, I think the hardest part will be what happened to the minds of Hungarians. And that will, I think, take decades. So when I fly back home, there's my father who is 83. He's not for Orbán for sure, but the amount of messaging that he has received in his mailbox daily from Victor Orbán with all sorts of unbelievable messages of hatred, most recently against Ukraine and Zelensky, basically nonstop. So whenever I fly home, he shows me these piles of, well-painted, beautiful materials, which are all full of hate. And you do wonder, how many years it will take to change that kind of mindset, since people have been listening to it nonstop for decades now.
Well, and your father's life was also very much conditioned by communism and by domination by the Soviet state. I'm actually kind of interested in, and you talk about Orbán being one of the leaders who stepped forward at the moment that the Soviet Union was crumbling to sort of hasten Hungarian independence. But then he ended up pretty much hand in glove with Putin. And I'm not saying every Russian is a Soviet communist, but Putin was very shaped by Soviet communism. And so how is it that somebody who cared so much about Hungarian freedom ended up being such a supporter of a ruthless autocrat like Putin?
It is mind-boggling, and I there are a lot of rumors and guesses, blackmailing, and so on. But there is also a simpler answer of simply political negotiations and power games in which Orbán realized. I mean, his view, and he said that quite publicly, is to have close relationships both with Russia and the United States and kind of navigate this kind of balance there. But as years have passed, the connection to Russia has become increasingly and incredibly concerning, to the level that the foreign affairs minister is, regularly reporting basically to his Russian counterpart. And I still can't put it together. That Victor Orbán I saw in 1989 demanding that the Russian troops leave Hungary, and the current Victor Orbán who repeats these horrendous lies about Ukraine. Right. And with a country, with the past of 1956, Hungary was occupied by the Soviets. They crushed that revolution. And then doing the switch and turning against an independent country that was crushed by Russia, right. It's incomprehensible still to me how that is possible. I grew up in a family where 1956 was, an everyday topic at home.
Yeah, I want to stick with that just for a second, because I've been thinking about 56 and the level to which it played such a huge part in the imaginary of the extreme right in the United States. People like Phyllis Schlafly, for example, people like Paul Weyrich, people who were really sort of the engineers of the extreme right's rise to power, which triumphed in 1980 with Ronald Reagan. And then Reagan sort of pushes them aside, and then they sort of percolate for a while, and they become the MAGA movement on a certain level. There are many other elements of the MAGA movement, but this old right, and part of what consolidates them in the mid-1950s is the United States saying they would go to the rescue of Hungary if the Hungarians resisted, and then Eisenhower doesn't do it. So how does 56 play in the imaginary of Hungarians in relation to the United States?
I mean, it's a lasting trauma. The no intervention from the United States. And I often mention this to American friends because it's, fashionable to criticize military interventions, and, rightly so in many cases. But there are also cases in which it's the central national trauma that there wasn't a U.S. intervention. And yes, that was something as I grew up that was mentioned. I had an uncle who had to emigrate in 56. So we kept talking about this issue and how it shaped, generations to come, including mine. I did grow up under communism in the first 10 years of my life. How Orbán was able to turn the country into a pro-Russia country, basically, is a long story about media, which you and I are so interested in. Right. But it wasn't immediate, and it was done with very careful polling, sophisticated propaganda machine. It's not your kind of old-school propaganda machine. And step by step, slowly he made that shift. But what is interesting now, that if you watch the videos from yesterday, these young people, 18, 20 years old, they were shouting, Russians leave the country, Russians out, Putin leave, and so on. So it is interesting how that kind of rhetoric is coming back, the 1989 understanding.
Yeah. Well, let's come back to this election and how it was engineered, because up until last year, I would have said this firm alliance between MAGA in the United States and the Orbán administration and Putin, I mean, it's kind of this weird axis of autocracy. And I would have said, okay, they've pretty much got things under control. I mean, we have CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Conference, holding a big meeting in Budapest. We have people writing about the rise of the right all over Europe. And then is it that Americans are not paying enough attention to Hungary, or did something really shift the calculus?
I think it was a very quick, really fast shift. So even as a Hungarian, it was possible to miss some months of Péter Magyar's rise.
Right.
Not in the last year, but if you think back during the 2 years. And I keep thinking of this question that you raised here with all that sophisticated machinery, with inviting American journalists to write about Hungary, to have all these fellowships for young journalists to live in Budapest in luxury apartments, and they, you just have to write about how well things are going and so on. And what happened to that whole system? And how is it possible that this one guy with a very basic operation of a really small stuff is able to shake that kind of system, that kind of determination that was there? And I don't think it was a clear story. It's not like one where you saw him rise up, but there were kind of ups and downs throughout. But I think ultimately we got a character who seemed really determined to bring change in a very authentic, unscripted ways, and including his failures and challenges of personality and turbulent private life and so on, kind of contributed to this relatable hero in contrast to an increasingly distant, faraway Orbán. And then, what I'm personally, I'm kind of thrilled about and couldn't sleep from the enthusiasm is just thinking of all these young people who haven't seen anything else. And now seeing something else. Will it work out? We will see. I mean, it will be incredibly difficult what he will have to do. Will he be an excellent prime minister? We don't know yet, but there will be something different. And that's a whole new ballgame.
Yeah. And of course, one of the things Orbán played really hard is he took advantage of the war in Syria and all kinds of destabilization in Northern Africa and the Middle East, driving refugees into Europe. And one way to get into Europe was through Hungary. And I remember very early on, Orbán basically puts up these huge fences and says, I'm just closing the border completely. You can just go sit over there and figure out what to do. And, he's really the first person, not just in Europe, but also, I don't think Donald Trump had talked about a wall, but the idea that actually anyone would do that was inconceivable. Are there other things that he did, much as Donald Trump does, that people said, oh, you can't do that, and he does it, and everyone's just sort of, they don't know what to do? What are some other things that he did?
Well, pretty much the 16 years were like that. Each time you felt like this cannot happen. The Supreme Court, the media, the university, Central European University being kicked out of Budapest. It's George Soros's university. It can never happen. Somebody will step in from the United States. Nothing happened. Oh, the EU will do something about it. Angela Merkel will say something. It's just 16 years of that. But it's also important to know that, for instance, in the area of migration and border control, the Orbán and Magyar messaging is not very different. And that comes from the political reality that most Hungarians do support strict border control. So Magyar did not really have, I think, a political chance to bring in a very different messaging on that. He may also believe that, but on that one particular issue, they actually align.
Right. And he also elected not to attend the LGBT Pride event. Where do you think he is on those issues? He seems kind of unreadable on them. Although on a certain point, I would say, if you have to do anything fast, sir, please address your constitution and please shore up democracy, and the rest will follow. But do we think there will be any relief for queer Hungarians and immigrant Hungarians?
So what happened in 25 that Orbán banned the Pride Parade, and every analyst agrees on that. He did it so that Péter Magyar will have to lead it. Like that. That basically said that.
Thank you.
Then, right? I mean, and then he has to say, oh, I'm going to have to step into this role and lead it. And then you lose the conservative part of your voting base. And he basically decided to stay out of it. He didn't attend, he didn't lead it, he didn't say anything. And then it was the biggest Pride ever. Everybody went out and ignored the ban. And it was a fantastic event, and it was better without him. And it was politically, I think, masterful. And there you have to kind of balance it. He could have attended and let it. You may not have a 2/3 majority. Then you can't change the constitution. Then you can't change the Supreme Court. So that's the kind of balance. But what's really interesting, Claire, I was watching his speech yesterday, and there was a direct line. There was one sentence about the LGBTQ community, and I don't think he has ever done that beforehand. At least that was like the clearest moment that it does, the regular line of like, it doesn't matter who you love, but, still support you. I mean, it was a kind of a basic formulation, but it was there in the first major speech as future prime minister.
It's interesting. You mentioned Hungarians feel very strongly about border security. That has actually been true since the 19th century. I've been doing some research on Susan Brownmiller, and both parts of her family came from Poland, but her father and his uncle traveled through the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the German Empire. And one of the things I learned is that both of those borders were closed to Poland, and they were open to each other, but they wouldn't take anyone from Russia and they wouldn't take anyone from Poland. So everybody who came from Poland in a certain window had to claim they were from somewhere else that was inside Austria-Hungary, which apparently was not that hard to do. But this question of border security really kind of goes back to the empire, pre-World War I, Imperial Europe. Let me ask you another question, and we're running a little bit over time, but if you can give us about 5 more minutes, why do you think civil society reemerged in Hungary so robustly? I mean, this is something we've been in despair about in the United States, and yet we're starting to see, mayor's offices that have been Republican for years flipping to the Democrats, school boards that have been Republican for years flipping to the Democrats, which makes me think our civil society is actually healthier than I knew. But what accounts for Hungarian civil society to be able to put this win together?
I believe there has been, steps and desires and attempts to try throughout the 16 years. And there were really courageous individuals and various communities who did a ton. So the real question is, why is there a change now? Because attempts were there, but what I think Péter Magyar did very well, that he created these so-called islands across the country, which were small communities working for change. Who understood the local community, who had the networks, and so on. So I know people even in the Tisza, the party of Péter Magyar, his island in Vienna. So it's not only within the borders, but even beyond. There are these little small communities working for him enthusiastically. But that's kind of the magic of history, right? Like your area. Right. Why is that the case, that sometimes the constellations simply come together and not in other cases when people really tried?
So we have a question here that says, how can we, I think that we as the United States, rebuild civil society so that the majority can stand up for democratic values? What's the secret sauce here, Julia?
The secret sauce, and it's possible that not every listener will like my answer on this one, but the secret sauce was patriotism. That he said it does not belong to the right. Victor Orbán was very powerful in communicating that the flag, the national symbols, language, national identity as such belongs to the right. And Péter Magyar said, no, it belongs to all of us. And there he is with a coalition from the far left to the far right, with having the flag at every single event, using the national symbols, literature, music, culture, and so on, continuously in every speech and every event. So I think the big lesson there is that it's sometimes not ideological purity that helps. It's not the narrowest conception of who we are, but some kind of broad coalition in which we forgive some things to others, right? Like we are not agreeing on everything, and that's okay as long as we work towards some kind of change and for our country.
Yeah. Well, Julia, thank you so much for your time. We're going to be watching Hungary very closely. I think Hungary has jumped back into Americans' consciousness as this kind of beacon of hope. which, by the way, what was that about, sending J.D. Vance over there to help Victor Orbán? I mean, do Hungarians actually do they even know who J.D. Vance is? Anyway, thank you so much for coming here to talk to us about it. Listeners, this is going to go up on the Political Junkie Substack. You can ask more questions there, and maybe I can talk Julia into coming into the comments section and answering some of them. So with that, Julia, I will see you back at the New School where we both belong, and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Claire. Thank you.